While we typically discuss drinking while we're alive, what do texts from the Second Temple period have to discuss about drinking after we've passed away? Well, that's something we're going to discuss on this episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. L'chaim. Welcome. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Claudia Bergmann. Are you a professor or doctor?
Yes, I am a professor.
Professor Claudia Bergmann. All right. So welcome, Professor Bergmann.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. All right. So for those less familiar with you, Professor Bergmann, what should we know about you?
I live in Central Europe in Germany, and I got my PhD from the University of Chicago. I worked there with Tikva Makensky and John Collins. A few years later, quite a number of years later, I did the second requirement for becoming a professor in Germany, my Habilitation at Ruhr-Universität Bochum, and I now work at Paderborn University as a visiting professor.
Very neat, very neat. All right, so you spent some time here in the Midwest.
Yeah, yes, I did. Quite a number of years, actually, Chicago.
Oh, wow. How many years, ultimately?
7.
Okay, that's a good chunk of time. All right, great. So we're discussing here, I would say, drinking or the lack thereof in the world to come in Second Temple literature, which I don't know that we would have necessarily have considered were it not for the noticeable appearance of drinking along with eating in rabbinic literature about the world to come. So first of all, how did you decide to research this, or how did you come across this?
I wish I had a funny story how this idea came into my head, but I don't. At some point, I just, I wanted to work on texts about the world to come. And at one point, I just noticed the immense amount of eating texts where people eat and are merry. And then I noticed that there was never any drinking. People are merry without any drinking. So I thought that was an interesting fact to look at. And I did. And I came up with some ideas why this could be the case. But of course, none of the texts that avoid the drinking say we avoid it because this and this and this. So this is all guesswork.
Wow. And you had come across references to food and feasting in the Hebrew Bible, right? Along with obviously Second Temple literature, which we'll get to, but you mentioned it exists. It's there in the Bible. So this, clearly predates the Second Temple literature and what they're working off of as well.
In the Hebrew Bible, eating and drinking is everywhere. Nourishment is so important for the contemporaries as it is for us now. I mean, being part of everyday life, of ritual life, of anything that involves a passage in life. Drinking and eating is everywhere, and that's why it is so amazing to me that the world to come in the corpus of texts that I looked at does not include drinking.
Wow. And so can you give us a sense of how do they discuss eating and what, especially for those listeners who may be less familiar with Second Temple literature, what types of works are we discussing, or even names?
All right. Well, I look at, I call it, or in the scientific community, we call it early Christian literature. An old name for it is Pseudepigrapha in Christian circles, but that's not really used anymore. It is literature from roughly 200 BCE to roughly 200 CE, so the 400 years around the turn of the era. The problem is that much of this literature that originated in Hebrew is no longer preserved in Hebrew manuscripts, but was transmitted over the centuries in other languages, and sometimes only by certain churches, by Christian communities that for some reason or other kept some of these texts as part of their canon. But we can tell from the translations and from the Greek or the Coptic or the Church Slavonic that they're written in today, that they had an older Hebrew source. So it is all right to call it early Jewish literature from that period of time, but sometimes we only have manuscripts written in Old Church Slavonic, Second Enoch, for instance, or in Syriac, Second Baruch. that originated much later. So only
Mm-hmm.
the translation is still available, not the original. And oftentimes the Christian communities did not have a problem editing these Hebrew texts and did it in such a way that one cannot even distinguish between, is this a Christian sentence or a Jewish sentence? They intermingled their ideas with the earlier Jewish ideas, so that it's very difficult for scholars to distinguish Jewish source and Christian source, and maybe actually we shouldn't even do that. We should just leave the texts as they are without and not distinguish between Christian and Jewish so much.
And just say they're Second Temple literature.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Very fascinating. How else? So clearly, there's this noticeable dearth of drinking mentioned here, with reference to the world to come in the Second Temple literature. What types of feasting or other food or other consumptive activities are described, though, in these texts?
Well, the corpus of texts that I looked at talk about abundance of food, of solid foods. Whatever is being served is there in abundance. So that's a big deal. We have fantastic food items such as manna. Manna, of course, appears in abundance. It rains down from heaven. We have a liquid word, rain. Behemoth and Leviathan provide an abundance of meat. Or the fruits from the tree of life are also served in the world to come, according to these texts. And also fruit can be a lot of fruit. So abundance is one of the key terms here. Fruit, manna, and the meat, Leviathan and Behemoth, are there in large numbers or in big pieces of big chunks of meat that can be consumed. This meal in the world to come happens at fantastic places, such as the Temple Mount or the Divine Mountain, the Garden Eden, or the entire world turns into a universal garden where this meal is being served. And one of the other interesting characteristics is that it has a beginning but no end. The texts describe it as starting at some point, but there's never any talk about the meal ending. And the people who are there are simply called the righteous. There's no distinction in regard to gender or age. We don't know whether this is men, women, children, old people, young people. It's just the righteous. So sometimes we have distinguished guests. Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob are sometimes there. God, the Messiah, is somehow present, but that's not laid out much. But the most of the people that are there are the righteous.
It is really fascinating here. No demographic differentiation, just the righteous, age, gender. Wow, that is fascinating. But I'm also fascinated by no end. It's an everlasting feast. It just continues and continues. That is fascinating. And obviously those fantastic beasts are a special piece of this. And how did you, so obviously there's a lot of food consumption, whether of animals. How did you, I mean, I don't know how else to ask. I'm thinking about the drinking. How did you notice this dearth of drinking references? Or is it just simply you notice before in the Hebrew Bible there's references, afterwards in the rabbinic literature there's references, and this is just a strange gap?
Well, think about the word feasting. If you have a party, you usually don't just eat. Even if there's no alcohol involved, you have other drinks. You have fruit juices, you have water, wine, beer, new wine, alcoholic beverages are everywhere in the Hebrew Bible, not always seen as good things, of course, but they are mentioned. And here they are not mentioned at all, although it is said all the time that the people are very merry. And very happy about being in the world to come. Often we associate merriment and feasting parties with alcohol or drinking in general, and it just the lack of drinking is simply noticeable. Also, on the basis of the text, occasionally we have references like the manna raining down from heaven, or references to water streams or streams of oil coming from the temple. When the texts go on, they talk about everyone who is hungry will eat. All the people who fear hunger will have nothing to fear anymore. But there's never any mention of thirst or drinking.
Hey there, I wanted to break in. I hope you're enjoying the episodes so far. Actually, I hope you're enjoying all of the episodes, or at the very least, most of them. And if you haven't, and if this is your first episode, go check more of them out. But if you have been enjoying them, and if you enjoy the other resources that are shared at jewishdrinking.com, I hope you think about the opportunity of supporting the work that we do here and continue to do. Please feel free to visit jewishdrinking.com/donate, and you can help support the work and continue our mission and our vision of bringing l'chaims to life. Thank you so much, and now back into the show. I know that in your article that we're basing this conversation off of, you mentioned that there are possible hidden references, right? So there's different images of potential weather stuff existing in basically nature, in addition to this oil, right?
Well, one good example is water. There's water imagery everywhere, but the water is not for drinking. The water is for fertilizing the soil so that the soil can produce solid foods. Or in Second Baruch, you have a reference to an abundance in agriculture, that the grapevines are just so abundant and they can make so much wine, and you wait for the next step, that someone will come and drink that wine, but it doesn't happen. It's just marveling about the amazing number of grapes and the amazing number of kegs of wine. No, it's barrels of wine, right? It's kegs of beer and barrels of wine. Container.
It's also it's also interesting because at the time they were largely using amphorae during the Second Temple time. Before there was like a second or third century transition to wooden barrels, but yeah.
Okay. They use actually measurement core. They say they make so many cores of wine. We don't really know how much a core is, but some kind of a container, some kind of a measurement. Everyone seems to be amazed by it, but nobody drinks it. So who is this wine for? We don't know. The texts simply don't talk about it.
Wow. It's just nice to have an abundance.
That's right.
It's also very peculiar. They're not seeking to drink it or providing that imagery of even the righteous consuming it at these feasts, at these banquets. I
believe in rabbinic literature you have drinking occasionally, but in these earlier texts, Second Temple literature, you don't.
And you also mentioned, you mentioned earlier the images of the natural grapes and these fantastic food items that could also be liquids, right? So that's another possibility there. And you also mentioned your article about new wine at Qumran, right? So what was that? What was that mentioned?
Well, some scientists think that Qumran literature provides a view into a community's idea of the world to come. But first of all, we don't know who deposited the scrolls at Qumran, what kind of community they represent, whether there was actually a group of people at Qumran who worked with these texts, or whether it was just a hiding place by the Dead Sea that they were hiding, let's say, I don't know, literature from the temple, or I don't know. So there are so many theories that we cannot say a community at the Dead Sea, at Qumran, had some kind of a prescription how to make new wine and drink it in the presence of the Messiah. There are texts that talk about the Messiah being present somehow as new wine is being created at Qumran, but we do not really know what that all means and whether anyone actually drank. They reach, even in those texts, they reach out their hand for the cup, but they are not described as being drinking.
Oh, wow. That's fast. I mean, we have, it's not to say that all the Qumran, we've done an episode here on Dead Sea Scrolls. They at least wrote about a wine festival. So we know that, that's a possibility, but fascinating for at least the world to come. It's a little.
That's right. Yeah. If it's in the context of the world to come, or with some kind of leader figure that might have messianic qualities, to him present. It's the drinking is again not mentioned.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek into one of the episodes that will be airing when we return in middle of August.
Now our winemakers come from everywhere, and they all do stages in different famous wineries in different wine regions around the world. They come back here, and it's a melting pot.
Hope you enjoy that sneak peek. Now back into this episode with Professor Bergmann.
It's something that I just noticed actually when I was looking over that article again in preparation for this podcast. I noticed that there are very few activities described that are physical things.
Oh, okay.
So people eat, but there is never any chewing, any tasting, enjoying on the palate, swallowing, or even digesting. You know, if you have a meal that takes forever, you would think that you would feel sick at some point, or you would have to go to the bathroom, or you would have to digest, or any of these physical things that are part of normal human life when we eat and drink or feast are not described. So maybe the drinking falls into that category as well. Maybe it's too explicitly physical that one would want to avoid it. This is just something that I noticed on the fly, so to speak.
Right. I wonder also if maybe possibly it's more about having these food items available, especially the more fantastic ones, the Leviathan and Behemoth, as well as knowing that you could be satiated, right? Since it goes on and on, it's not like you have 5 minutes to eat and that's it. That you can eat to satiation, but it's not about the experience, and thus it's not about the drinking, the eating, the consuming, or expelling, I guess. But it's just.
But where's the enjoyment from then? If you just eat to make your body full, that's not very enjoyable. I mean, it's at least from my perspective, eating is not just for nourishing my body so that it can live on, but eating is also for enjoyment and for company and for all kinds of ritual purposes to evoke memories. In my case, you know, when I eat potato dumplings from Germany, I feel this great peace in my body somehow, and I'm reminded of my grandparents, of my grandmother, of my mother who made these. And I mean, eating is so much more than just filling up your body, and so is drinking. And the fact that they do not mention these enjoyable aspects of eating, and they do not mention drinking at all, seems odd and noticeable to me. So maybe this is continued in the rabbinic literature, because there are some rabbinic texts that say that there will be no need for food in the world to come. Some of them talk about abundance too, rabbinic texts, but some deny that there's even a need for eating or drinking or sexual pleasures in the world to come. And some of them discuss the fact, can you even serve kosher meat in the world to come? You know, how do you kill Leviathan and Behemoth? So maybe we'll leave this whole chewing, tasting, smelling, enjoying out as much as we can. Maybe that's the reason.
Interesting. I also wonder how much of this is reflective of their own material and physical circumstances in the Second Temple. It could also reflect the specific instance, the milieu of the writers themselves. So were they lacking or otherwise wanting for food, or for that matter, for drink? Or what were their own material situations and circumstances that this would somehow maybe be an inversion of their realities? And I imagine that this, you know, certainly there are times when people yearn for the Messianic era because they're going through certain struggles in the very real lived lives, but what will fix all those things and remedy that. So I don't know
for sure.
I don't know if that's somehow different and otherwise reflective, where drinking is not an issue for them. They're fine, but the rabbis need to mention it.
For sure. Often things like that are mentioned because there's a problem with it.
Yeah.
the fear of gluttony, the fear of drunkenness, and so on. We do have archaeological evidence for beer and wine production. So it seemed to have been something totally normal, nothing to worry about there. There was no lack of wine, apparently, at the time when these texts appeared, were written, and no lack of beer or other beverages.
Yeah. Israel is a particularly well suited and situated land for wine production. And beer is also there. It gets less attention, fewer attention, but it's nevertheless there. Hey there, wanted to break in. You might have caught a couple of episodes that had a really fascinating segment, a new experimental segment we're doing on the show where we invite drink recommendations, whether beers, wines, liqueurs, spirits, and more from viewers like you. I'd love to hear more. If you want to send in a 60 to 90 second video of yourself sharing a recommendation of perhaps even an uncommon beverage, something that you find interesting and you think others would greatly benefit from trying, please send it to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show. One thing you mentioned in your article were some items of speculation as to why you think it could be that these are very glaringly missing drinking. Despite the biblical precursors, the rabbinic successors, they all mention drinking. These glaringly omit it. So what might be your speculations?
The Hebrew Bible already talks about the alcohol abuse and drunkenness, and how this is supposed to be avoided at all costs. And maybe this falls into that category too, that we don't mention drinking, so that there is no, not even the slightest indication that the righteous in the world to come would get drunk. Because that wouldn't be a good thing, right? If you're with God and you're enjoying the world to come, how can you get drunk?
Maybe.
So you don't mention drinking at all. That could be one thing.
My little pushback, by the way, of the 19 appearances of drunkenness, the word shichrut in the entirety of the Tanakh. So the 19 appearances, there's a bunch in Jeremiah and Isaiah. That's like 9 out of the 19 right there. We don't have so many other ones, and usually they're more poetic or whatever. Of course, I think people are familiar with the stories in Genesis. In Genesis 9 with Noah, it's very notable. Although it's fascinating how people understand that story and what the danger of alcohol is, or more specifically drunkenness. In chapter 19 in Genesis, it's not even mentioned drunkenness. It's just so utterly obvious with Lot, with his daughters. But really fascinatingly, in chapter 43, in verse 34, where Joseph's brothers come to Egypt, they all drink and get drunk, but nothing crazy happens. So it's so fascinating. I mean, this is just my own little excursus here, which is Noah it's discovering it comes as a surprise to drunkenness. With Lot and his daughters, they know exactly what they're doing with it and how to use it. With the brothers, with Joseph and his brothers, it seems as if they know how to properly and appropriately use it. They all get drunk and nothing crazy happens. It's almost like this is now part of human society. This is we get drunk off of it and nothing crazy happens. Certainly not for the rest of the 5 books of Torah. And it happens here and there. Of course, in the early book of Samuel, Hannah comes to pray and is questioned if she's drunk. She says, "No, I haven't had beer or wine. I'm totally sober. I'm just, emotional," and so forth. So it's really fascinating. I think I haven't really seen anybody do a real proper study of these 19 plus appearances of drunkenness in the Hebrew Bible. But I think people think it's so negative. I think it's a lot more gray than that.
But crazy things can potentially happen.
Oh, for sure.
That's always in the back of people's minds and authors when they write these texts. And we have numerous examples from the Middle Ages where drunkenness is frowned upon because pollution of any kind can happen when you are at a bar and you drink, and all of a sudden there's a Christian waitress, and oh my God, what can happen? So you better not get drunk in a Christian establishment.
I mean, it's always a wild card. Drunkenness is always a wild card. You never know what can happen. And I don't know that there are many societies that explicitly valorize drunkenness, but I don't know that it's necessarily entirely demonized either in the Bible. Okay. So that's really what I'm trying to say. It's not a black and white issue. It's sure the early stories, it might demonize it, or problematizes it, but it's not so inherently negative or otherwise bad.
At the time when my text originated, moderation was also a big issue. So we're talking about the Book of Tobit, things like that. Gluttony was ascribed to the others. Gluttony in drinking and eating. So when Jewish identity was supposed to be created, exactly during that time when my text originated, one would describe oneself as being moderate, while the others against whom one wanted to distinguish oneself were the ones who ate and drank to no end. Yes, in excess. So we have a number of examples from that period where the foreign kings are described as eating cow after cow, and I don't know what amazing thing they eat and to drink in excess, while a true Jewish person would not. So this fear of gluttony seems to be one that is emerging at that time as well.
There is certainly, even in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, a concern more against the royalty or people with power and other material means of people who just continue. I'm thinking about the drinking, but it could also be true with eating. Just eat and this is certainly true in the book of Proverbs, where kings eat and drink at inappropriate times. They're getting drunk in the morning because they don't have to wake up and be productive. They are in charge. It's good to be the king, but there are no controls. And so certainly in the book of Proverbs, it's an inappropriate time to be drinking. It's funny what you're mentioning about others, because we did an episode on the book of Judith, where a very important turning point in the story is Judith provides wine to, I think, is it Holofernes or whomever the foreign power is, and gets him drunk, and that creates a vulnerability for him.
Yeah.
And that's the other.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There are numerous Greek texts about that too, Hellenistic texts that originated at the time and do the same thing. We, as the Greeks, we do it right, and the others, the Persians. So it's a common thread at that time that the others are the ones who drink and eat too much, and we are moderate, and no bad things can happen to us.
Wow.
So that could be one of the things why the authors wrote our texts, my texts, in that way. And the third thing might be the fear of ritual pollution, not just libations to other gods. We hear in the Hebrew Bible about libations to foreign gods a lot, but also liquids can be
susceptible to impurity.
Yes. In our Qumran text, we hear that a lot, that the initiates into the Qumran community do things in steps. And the last step is that they can participate in the drinking of the community. When they are very high in the rank of the community, only then are they allowed to drink with them. And it might be that this fear of ritual pollution via liquids also plays into this lack of drinking in the world to come.
Wow.
Although one would wonder, why would one have this problem in the world to come? Isn't all danger, all temptation, everything like that removed as well?
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. I know you might think that Jewish drinking only exists on podcasts, but guess what? It can be so much more. Have you ever wondered how to elevate an experience for your shul, JCC, other organizations, even businesses? I'm more than happy to chat to see how we can bring that to you. You can feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. We can see how I can help you bring l'chaims to life.
We said in the beginning that my ideas are guesses, so to speak. There might be different reasons why this is the case, that there's no drinking in the world to come in my text, but I wish that somebody would just come by and send me an email and say, this is the reason why.
Professor Bergmann, this has been insightful, fascinating, and making me really intrigued to explore drinking in the world to come in rabbinic texts. But before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
I would like to show you my book that I wrote on this.
Yeah.
Feasting Without End, Apocalyptic Ideas About Eating in the World to Come in Early Judaism and Its Biblical Roots. Unfortunately, it's in German, so I would love for a publisher to say, let's do this in English.
All right. That looks like a big book. So it'd be a lot to translate from the Deutsch.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, Professor Bergmann, this has been great. Thank you so much, and l'chaim.
L'chaim.